Hey everyone, welcome to the fifth episode of NGBE Live. In this episode, we have Philippe De Ryck, who will teach us about token security in Angular applications, and we have James Henry, who will teach us how we can start using ESLint in Angular applications. Welcome, Philippe, and welcome, James.
Hi, Jurgen and co. Nice to be here.
Thank you so much for joining. Before we dive in, let's meet our panelists for today. We have Maarten Tibau.
Hi.
We have Yannick Houbrix.
Hi.
And we have Sam Vloeberghs.
Hello.
Welcome, Maarten, Yannick, and Sam. Knowledge is the key to getting security right. That's the motto of our first guest, Philippe De Ryck. After running the commercial web security training program at the Royal University of Leuven, Philippe founded his own company, Pragmatic Web Security, to travel the world and train developers on web security and security engineering. World-leading tech companies, financial institutions, and healthcare companies rely on a daily basis on Philippe to keep their developers up to date with the latest security best practices. Philippe has a PhD in web security, is a Google developer expert, an Auth0 ambassador, a SecAppDev board member, and a true NGBE veteran as a loyal speaker and trainer. In this session, Philippe will dive into the security properties of Angular applications. He will teach us why local storage is insecure and discuss potential alternatives. By the end of the session, we will be able to decide where to store our tokens in Angular applications. And even better, we'll be able to explain why. Philippe has agreed to taking questions after his talk, so if you have any questions, please submit them via the live chat on the YouTube page, and we'll be happy to ask them for you during the Q&A. And also, if you like what you hear, make sure to leave some claps in the chat there as well. With that, let's give it up for Philippe De Ryck.
It's awesome. Everybody clapping on mute. It's perfect. It's a thought that counts. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Jurgen. And it's my pleasure to be here. Well, NGBE is one of my favorite conferences, so the live version is, of course, not the same. But, well, it's good enough for now, and hopefully we'll be back in December. But for now, let's talk about token security in Angular applications. Well, single-page applications, Angular applications. It's going to be about token security in the browser, so it kind of applies to other application frameworks as well. But of course, the people here will be Angular developers mainly. All right, so let's dive right in. Right, so everybody who has the need to store tokens will probably know about the use of local storage. Local storage is the most common place to store tokens, and it's one of the conflicted solutions. Like, a lot of people are like, yeah, just use local storage, it's fine. And other people are like, yeah, but you probably don't want to do that because of some reasons. And that's what I'm going to dive into. And as we progress, I'm going to use a couple of examples as use cases to illustrate what the problem is and what we can kind of do to avoid that problem. And it's going to be a complicated story, so I'll need my 30 minutes or 35 minutes to get through this. Let's start off easy. Local storage is basically a browser-based storage area. It's a container in a browser to store key value pairs. Like, you have a key, favorite cooking technique, and a value sous vide, and you can set item, get item. I mean, that's kind of the way JavaScript APIs work, and that's as simple as things can get API-wise. Data in local storage is isolated per origin. So basically, if you deploy an application on a domain, then every application will have a separate origin, a separate local storage container. So my application has its own data, and another application cannot easily read that data unless it's running in the same origin, HTTPS app.restgrid.com and 443. If you do this, things might be fine until somebody comes along and says like, yeah, but this is a security risk. This is a security problem in your application, because if somebody can inject JavaScript code, if somebody can exploit a cross-site scripting vulnerability, they can read local storage. So if you put tokens there, sensitive tokens, and an attacker succeeds into exploiting a cross-site scripting vulnerability, then the attacker will be able to read tokens from local storage. So how does that work? Well, Very concretely, the attacker would inject a piece of code like this. And this piece of code is very simple. We create a new image, and then we load that image, or we instruct the browser to load the image file from a malicious server called maliciousfood.com. I'm kind of a foodie, so this kind of makes sense to use these domains for me. And the data is a query parameter here. You can see on line 2, we basically stringify the entire local storage object and drop that information right in that URL. And that's essentially the premise that I'm going to use to talk about security, and we're going to use OAuth tokens, which are fairly advanced, as an example of why token security is so difficult to get right. So that's the setup. I had a slide about myself, which is kind of pointless now because Jurgen gave this very beautiful introduction. So I have images for the words of Jurgen. So basically, I run my own company, Pragmatic Web Security, and through that company, I consult with other companies to help them build more secure applications. And I also do online courses and stuff like that. But you got that from Jurgen, so we can go back to local storage. So what's the real problem here? Well, tokens stored in local storage are easy to extract when malicious code executes. And there's a variety of ways that malicious code can end up in the application, and that's not really too important here. This can be through a vulnerability in your application code. That's one way. It can be in a vulnerability from a file you load remotely or whatever. The thing is, the red box here, the code from the attacker executes inside your application. And as I said before, one of the most common problems that people think of is stealing data from local storage. And that's exactly the problem that we will try to avoid. And this is not something new, right? This is not some big revelation that I came up with this morning, like, oh my God, you can steal tokens from local storage. No, this is something that's well known. Even if you look at a landscape like OAuth, which is a fairly elaborate landscape, but they heavily rely on tokens, and they allow single page applications like Angular apps to handle tokens directly. They know about this problem, and they kind of try to prevent that. So how does OAuth address the problem of token security? Well, in OAuth you have two types of tokens. You have an access token and a refresh token. A refresh token is what a client, a single page application, can use to obtain a new access token that's valid for a short period of time. Let's say 5 to 10 minutes. With that access token that it has for 5 to 10 minutes, the application, the Angular app, can contact an API and make certain requests. And then 10 minutes later, the token expires. So in case it's stolen, no biggie, because it expires after 5 to 10 minutes. So that's already an integrated security measure, right? Because even if somebody steals that access token from local storage, it's only valid for 5 minutes. So usually they can't do too much harm. Well, it depends a bit on the application, but in general, that's the idea. However, a single page application in OAuth also can get a refresh token. That's something that changed like a couple of years ago in 2019, but today it can have a refresh token because it needs to get new access tokens over and over and over again during its lifetime, right? Refresh tokens in a single page app are what we call bearer tokens. And a bearer token basically means that whoever holds the token is the bearer of the token. They can use that token, or they get the authority to use that token. So this is a red flag. This is why I also put this in red. Like, so if somebody, an attacker, executes malicious code in your application and they can steal that refresh token, they can now go to the authorization server and ask that server, like, hey, just give me a new access token. I'm the client, which is not true, but the attacker assumes they are, or impersonates the client, and they get a new access token and they can access the API. And that would be a problem because now it's not for 5 to 10 minutes, but for the lifetime of that refresh token, which can be 12 hours, days, or even weeks. Well, weeks is not recommended, but it's possible. You can configure your servers that way. So, brings us back to stealing tokens from local storage. Big problem, not an unknown problem. So that's why the OAuth specs, when they allowed single page applications, JavaScript apps, to handle refresh tokens, they said like, yeah, this is kind of dangerous. So we need to apply some additional protection here. And that additional protection is called, in this case, it's a mechanism known as refresh token rotation. And I have a very nice timeline to illustrate what that means in practice. So refresh token rotation works as follows. So the app, the single page application, the Angular app in this case, but it can just as well be a React app or a Vue app or whatever, just Angular, that's the framework we talk about here. We'll run something we call the authorization code flow. Details are absolutely not important, but the app receives an access token, AT1, and a refresh token, RT1. And AT1 has a lifetime of, let's say, 10 minutes. So the app is going to use refresh token 1 after 9 minutes to obtain a new access token, AT2. And when refresh token rotation is enabled, one of the things that happens is that the server also gives you a new refresh token. So RT1 is only used once, and from that point on, the app receives RT2, refresh token 2, which it is supposed to use the next time it runs a refresh token flow. So when access token 2 expires, you can see where this goes, right? The app will use RT2, the latest token, to obtain token set 3, which is AT3 and RT3, and we can keep doing this until I run out of slide, which is one time more. You get a token set 4 using refresh token 3. And it just keeps going and going until the application decides that it doesn't want to run anymore, so it closes down, or the refresh token expires, which is also an option. So with refresh token rotation, we kind of try to address the problem of a stolen refresh token. So refresh tokens can only be used once, basically. You use it once. So even if somebody steals it, they're not really supposed to be able to use it. And that's why the server handling tokens here, the security token service, they basically enforce a restriction. And that restriction works as follows. So let's assume that in our legitimate scenario from before, the attacker manages to sneak malicious JavaScript code into the application. Maybe through posting a piece of data that contains code, and that code executes in your Angular app. Boom. You now have a cross-site scripting vulnerability, and the attacker steals refresh token 2 from the browser, from the user's browser, not the user's browser, because it was stored in local storage, for example. So the attacker now has a refresh token. The attacker is like, awesome, I have a refresh token, so I'm going to run a refresh token flow because I'm now the client, which is not true, but the attacker impersonates the client and receives access token 3 and refresh token 3, which is a problem because the attacker can now start calling APIs on behalf of that user. And the API will be like, oh yeah, sure, that seems valid, and everything looks good. However, and this is the glue that binds everything together, when the application wants to use refresh token 2, my apologies, when it uses refresh token 2, as it is supposed to do because access token 2 is about to expire, the authorization server here will see like, hold on, I already saw refresh token 2 before, so this is something I don't expect because I gave you refresh token 3, so what the hell are you doing calling me with refresh token 2? And it basically detects this behavior and it says like, this is probably not good. The whole idea here is that if this happens, then somebody has probably stolen one of these refresh tokens and is using it instead of the application. And when that happens, the authorization server says like, in that case, I'm going to kill all tokens associated with this chain of refresh tokens. So it's basically going to revoke RT3 or 4 or 5 or 6, however far the attacker got with this mechanism to ensure that these tokens are no longer valid. And in that case, the attacker loses their access. So the moment the legitimate client also uses the refresh token, the attacker loses their access to obtain fresh access tokens, so to access the API on behalf of the user. Awesome, right? So why the hell am I here talking about token security if things are really that simple? Well, because things aren't really that simple. That's unfortunately always the case when we talk about security. This whole concept seems to be based on a misconception of what the attacker can really do with malicious JavaScript code. This whole misconception believes or seems to assume that the attacker can do a single thing. You inject code and you can do a single thing like steal data. And that's absolutely wrong. That's a false assumption of how cross-site scripting or malicious JavaScript code works in practice. And that's takeaway number 1 in this presentation. It's a common misconception that once you have the execution of malicious JavaScript code, that it can only do a single event, steal data, change the page. One thing. No, it can do a lot more, and we'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. All right, so malicious JavaScript is somewhat tricky, and again, this is not something new here. I'm not giving any big revelations here. This is not something that should surprise an experienced developer. because we've been dealing with this crap for ages, basically. We've been dealing with this from long before we had Angular applications, back when we had beautiful backend apps with PHP or Java server pages or ASP.NET or something like that. And back then we used cookies. It's not ice cream, but it's cookies. So cookies are a different concept. So let's see if how that works in practice. Well, cookies are just cookie jar, and this seems ridiculous, but I'm really not making this up. The browser actually has a concept called the cookie jar, which keeps track of cookies for different domains. And the cookie jar is accessible from JavaScript. Don't ask me why, they just added that and things happen from there. So probably today they would avoid that feature, but the cookie jar is accessible from JavaScript, so the legitimate application can read its cookies from JavaScript, but also malicious code can do the same thing. So we have basically the same attack vector as before, literally the same code, except for local storage. We now use document.cookie to retrieve information from the cookie jar. And that's essentially the same issue. But we have a solution for that. In the cookie world, we kind of figured out that this was a problem, so a concept was added to cookies like a long time ago, maybe 10, 15 years ago, and that concept is called HTTP only. And HTTP only basically means this cookie is for HTTP traffic or HTTPS traffic, network traffic only, and should not be read from JavaScript. This cookie, if you set it like this, there's a lot more going on security-wise, but if you set a cookie like this, it cannot be accessed from JavaScript, which is awesome because it kind of avoids this whole problem, right? So you put your sensitive token in the cookie or a session ID in the cookie, and then you mark it HTTP only, and JavaScript cannot read it. So even if malicious JavaScript executes, the problem goes away. And that is absolutely amazing. Unfortunately, it's not very secure. I really love this image. I've been using it for a long time as well. If you look from the outside of the door, things look very secure, like, oh, the door is locked and probably can't get in. But if you look from the inside, you kind of know it's not going to be very strong security-wise. And if somebody pushes the door or somebody on the inside gets hungry, it depends on which comes first, the door will be unlocked. That's essentially how HTTP-only cookies work as well. And again, we've known about this for a long time. So what can the attacker do? Well, the attacker may not be able to read the cookie directly, but the attacker can steal data from the application's pages. So if you're building a healthcare app, the malicious JavaScript code can read healthcare information from the page, just like that. So whatever is being displayed is accessible to the malicious JavaScript code. They can read it, ship it off somewhere else, and you're now leaking information. And some authorities don't take kindly on applications that leak information. The attacker can also modify the UI to trick the user. Very easy, JavaScript can do whatever the hell it wants, basically. So if you're building a banking application, the attacker could add a transaction to the list of transactions and then change the page so the user doesn't see it. And then you're like, yeah, I'm done doing wire transfers, so I'm going to sign my stuff, and you enter a code, and boom, and all of a sudden, next time you log in, you notice that you lost a lot of money because of a trick like this. Really, really dangerous attack, perfectly possible from JavaScript. And the JavaScript code can also send requests to the backend with cookies, because if JavaScript sends a request to a server, the browser will attach HTTP-only cookies to that request, because they can't be read from JavaScript, but they can be used on requests, and the attacker code, the malicious code, is virtually indistinguishable from legitimate application code. And that's a bit of a problem. And actually, this is called session writing, this problem. Session writing because the attacker is writing along on an existing session of the user by sending requests from that client application. And it's a problem that we haven't really solved in backend web applications. It's something that we have to try to avoid by taking away the attack vector, the injection of malicious JavaScript code in the first place, but we can't really solve session writing any other way reliably. So that brings me to a question. If unstealable cookies, which unstealable is not really a word, but you kind of get the meaning even if it's wrong. If unstealable cookies are not secure because of things like session writing, what the hell does that mean for tokens? Well, the news is not very good. Let me go back to our refresh token rotation scenario. Let's say that I've shifted things to the left, so don't worry about that. But let's say at some point in time, we have this malicious code executing in the application. And the attacker steals refresh token 1 but doesn't use it. They just steal it and send it off to a server controlled by the attacker. So the attacker now has RT1, but they don't use it. And the application just keeps on running and is very happy, and it uses RT1 to get token set 2, and nothing's wrong. And the malicious code from the attacker is still there. It's not a one-shot event, no, it's still there, running in the background, doing whatever it does. And in this case, it's like, ooh, you got refresh token 2, that's awesome. You know what? I'm going to steal it. Mine. And the attacker doesn't use it. And the attacker, or the malicious code, does a second thing. It monitors. It has either a heartbeat feature or it monitors closing operations, but it detects that the user has stopped using the application, the single page app. Like we all do, we don't really log out from our online bank, right? We just close the tab and we're done. It's easy because if you forgot something, you can just reopen the tab and you're still logged in. Very handy if you want to do that, but also potentially insecure, but whatever. The attacker detects that the user has stopped using the app, closes the app. So the legitimate code doing this refresh token rotation is no longer running. The legitimate application is no longer using refresh tokens to send to the server. So refresh token 2 will not be used, allowing the attacker to now start using refresh token 2 to obtain token set 3. And use refresh token 3 for 4 and 5 and 6 and 7, all the way until that refresh token chain expires. A refresh token rotation is absolutely useless here, because there's no token reuse. There will be no alarm bells on the server because the legitimate application is no longer using these tokens and there will be no token reuse, so nothing to detect. And that brings us to takeaway number 2. All functionality that you can use as a developer can be used by the attacker as well. If you can think of something cool to do in JavaScript, guess what? An attacker can do exactly the same thing in malicious JavaScript. So if you can use monitor close operations or send requests, then the attacker can do the same thing, and so on and so on and so on. And that's the real threat of malicious JavaScript code. It can do whatever the hell it wants, and it can do the same things as you. Or, in even a worse case, if the attacker is a better developer than you are, which in my case would definitely be the case, then they can do more than you can do because they can write better code. And that's essentially the true danger here. It's not a single operation, no, it's whatever the hell they want to do. So, what can you do? Well, avoid malicious JavaScript code in the first place. But that's something for a different time. That's not something I can talk about now. It would take me way too long to do that. Even though Angular is pretty awesome at that, it still requires a lot of due diligence and a lot of secure coding guidelines on your end to make sure that doesn't happen. On the token security front, there's a couple of things that you'll find in practice. And one of these things is really, really cool. And it's used by the OAuth0 SDK to transform your Angular application into such an OAuth client. So OAuth with these access tokens and refresh tokens, well, OAuth0 is one of the servers that issues tokens to your applications. You can use them. I use them for my applications. And what's pretty awesome here is that this SDK, which you integrate, it's literally like 5 lines of configuration and 1 line of code and you're done. It's absolutely powerful. And that SDK handles tokens for you, so you don't even have to worry about that. And what they do is actually pretty awesome. Even though it's insufficient, it's pretty awesome. What they do is they use a web worker to handle sensitive tokens. And the web worker is represented by this little green triangle, and of course the very invisible web worker, but I've kind of visualized it to make sense for this presentation. And that web worker will handle refresh tokens. It runs in a separate memory space. It's isolated from the main application, and whatever data is stored in that web worker is not accessible from outside that worker. So you can kind of assume where this is going, right? The application will run the authorization code flow. Well, basically the SDK running in your application will start this OAuth flow with the OAuth0 servers. And then when push comes to shove, the SDK asks the worker like, yeah, you just handle tokens. Exchange this code so you can get tokens, and the worker will diligently do that. All behind the scenes, by the way. You don't have to worry about any of that when using that SDK. So the worker completes the flow and receives tokens in step number 4 right here. Receives an access token, AT1, and a refresh token, RT1. And, this is pretty cool, the web worker only exposes the access token. It sends the access token back to the application like, yeah, you can access APIs, here's a token, but it's keeping the refresh token all for itself. So it doesn't expose a refresh token. Awesome. So what happens 9 minutes later when AT1 is about to expire? The application, well, the SDK is like, oh my token is about to expire. Dear web worker, can you please get me a new token using that refresh token that you have hidden so kindly in your memory space? And that web worker is like, yeah, of course I can. And it's going to run that refresh token flow with RT1, and it's going to receive access tokens, AT2 and RT2 in step 8. And again, it exposes the access token to the application, but keeps the refresh token hidden inside that web worker's memory space. And this pattern is actually really beautiful. This warms my heart a little bit as a security expert, because this is the way we need to implement resilient SDKs. This is, I've told them as well, but this is a seriously good job by the team behind that at Auth0. So the main context interacts with the web worker using the web messaging API by sending messages like, hey man, can you get me a new access token, please? And the web worker will do that. And the sensitive data, the refresh token, the bearer refresh token, is not extractable in this scenario. Awesome. It's only available in the worker. Malicious JavaScript, unless it can access the worker, which in this case is not the case, there's no way to do that, then malicious JavaScript code running in the main application will not be able to steal that token from the worker. And that brings us to takeaway number 3. A web worker here can be used to isolate sensitive functionality from the main application context. So whenever you have something that's really sensitive and you want to hide it somewhat, using a web worker may be the right way to go. All right. This would be nice if this was the end, so that would be a very happy story like, oh yeah, we can hide stuff in web workers. But unfortunately, this is not the end. We're only about halfway through. All right. So what's the problem here? Well, the problem is that the application or the web worker still exposes access tokens. And if your legitimate application can get them, so can malicious JavaScript code. So the attacker in this case, the attacker realizes like, yeah, these refresh tokens are off limits. I can't get to them, but I can steal the access token the whole time. I can steal each time a new access token is sent to the application. I can get it and send it off to a server controlled by me. And that's a bit of a problem. It reduces the attack, by the way. The attack has gone from stealing refresh tokens and getting long-term access in the name of the user to only getting access tokens as long as the user is running the application. Because when the user closes the application, the attack vector goes away. But it's still there. If you want to know how to do that specifically, the details are a bit more subtle or complicated than what I want to discuss here, but I wrote an article about that last year, and you can find that on my website. So there's a simple proof of concept to actually steal access tokens coming out of that web worker and ship them off. Well, print them on the console here, but you can ship them off somewhere else if you want to. And that brings us back to takeaway number 2, which is kind of going backwards, but the attacker has the same capability as the legitimate application code. So if your legitimate application code has a way to get that access token out of the worker or receive it from the worker, the attacker can subvert that mechanism and can probably intercept that as well. And that's essentially what causes the problem here. But there's more. Like if we can abuse these features, what else can we abuse? Because we're running code in the browser, maybe we can do some other crazy things as well. And one of these crazy things actually sidesteps all of the protections that we talked about before. One of these crazy things is running a malicious payload that will add an event listener to the application, like listen to events, message events coming in, and we create a hidden iframe. And in that hidden iframe, we run a new OAuth flow. So the details require a little bit of knowledge about OAuth, so I'm going to go over it high level. But in essence, we're completely ignoring what the application is doing. The application is running its SDK with web workers and it's obtaining its tokens and everybody's happy there. So that's good. While we do that, the first time you do that, the user actually has to authenticate to this authorization server. They will have to log in so that the token will be linked to a particular user. And that session in step 1 is maintained with a cookie. That cookie is handled by the browser, and that's essentially how you can enable single sign-on, or why you don't have to re-authenticate in your Angular app every 10 minutes, and so on and so on. That's essentially what that session cookie does. It's stored in the browser in a secure way. It's not accessible from JavaScript, and so on and so on. However, this is where the malicious code comes in. Malicious code is injected in the application. It sets up that listener that I showed you before, and it loads that hidden iframe, which is the rectangle here. In reality, it's a little bit more hidden than this giant rectangle on the page, but you get the idea here. In that iframe, the attacker is going to run a new flow, just like the application ran one in step 1 with the authorization server. And due to the way that OAuth flows work with cookies in browsers, the browser will send a cookie that exists in the server on or during step 4. Which basically tells the authorization server, like, hey, this was Philippe from 10 minutes ago requesting tokens. And the authorization server is like, oh yeah, I know Philippe. He's pretty cool. Here are tokens for Philippe, dear single page application. Unbeknownst to the fact that this is not the application asking, but the malicious code asking that. And that's essentially what we're trying to abuse here, or what we're effectively abusing. And this step 4, will give the attacker the response from the iframe, which is basically a set of tokens. Well, it's a little bit more complicated, but that's what it comes down to. The attacker now has an unrelated set of tokens. So instead of AT1 and RT1, it's going to be attacker token 1 and attacker refresh token 1. It's for the user, for the single page application, but it's used by the attacker in this case. And the attacker ships them off to a server controlled by them, and they can now read those tokens and abuse them. And this is pretty depressing because it circumvents everything that we have to prevent this. It circumvents refresh token rotation because there's no token reuse. It prevents the hiding of stuff in the web worker because we don't need to access the data in the web worker. And there's some other advanced OAuth security mechanisms like Depop or something like that, which also doesn't help anything here. And that's a bit of a problem. That brings us to a slide like this. First of all, malicious code can do a lot more than a single action. So it's not about steal stuff from local storage, it's about executing JavaScript code. Malicious code can do anything that a legitimate frontend can do, which is problematic. So your responsibility is to focus on cross-site scripting mitigations to avoid the execution of malicious JavaScript and apply defense in depth mechanisms like sandboxing and SRI and CSP and so on and so on and so on. And this is honestly pretty depressing for a talk. Like, yeah, token security, like, oh crap, we can't secure tokens. Well, unfortunately, I'm not done yet. I have one more part that I want to go into. And that's the current best practice for security-sensitive single-page applications using this OAuth token-based mechanism. And it pretty much holds for other token-based mechanisms as well, but there's a couple of details that I'm going to explain specific to OAuth. And that concept, what we're going to use here, is called a backend for frontend, or a BFF in short. And in a backend for frontend scenario, we augment our single-page application with a backend component. And I know that some of you will be shivering like oh my god, no backends, please. But the backend is actually a naive backend component. It doesn't do any processing. It's simply, it's kind of a reverse proxy that will channel requests from the single page application to an actual API. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't apply business logic. It just translates some data into other data. That's essentially it. Instead of making our Angular app the OAuth client with its security issues, we make that backend BFF part the OAuth client. And in OAuth, that means that we have client authentication, which is a stronger mechanism. It means that refresh tokens cannot be easily abused, and so on and so on. So our backend component is the component asking tokens from the server, not the frontend. And the BFF will keep those tokens on the server. That's essentially already a big win, because tokens are no longer exposed to the frontend. Good. By the way, backend clients, confidential clients, can apply much better security practices in an OAuth world than frontend applications. But just remember that. When a backend handles tokens, it's always much more secure. So, how do we make the connection between the frontend and the BFF? Well, with a good old-fashioned cookie. The frontend and the BFF, they typically run in the same domain, so we can use cookies to keep track of a session. And I'm going to leave it in the middle whether you want to make this a stateful session where you have an ID and data on the server, which is probably not what you want, but sometimes you do, or whether you want to encrypt those tokens and put them in a cookie and push that cookie to the browser. That's also an option. What matters is that the cookie will be sent on requests between the front end and the BFF, and that cookie allows the BFF to translate the cookie, whatever is in there, into an actual token when it forwards that request to the API. And that's essentially what happens here. The BFF will proxy every call from the front end to an API in the backend and translate the cookie on that request into the actual access token. And when the access token is expired, it will use a refresh token to get a new access token, and so on and so on and so on. And that's essentially takeaway number 4. A BFF keeps tokens out of the browser, which is a good thing because it significantly increases security. That's essentially the only real way we can secure tokens in single-page applications, by not exposing them to single-page applications, which is a bit ironic, but this works really well in practice, by the way. And ask anyone building security-sensitive OAuth apps like financial apps, healthcare apps, the BFF is the correct way to do this today. But that still leaves session writing, right? So what if we had that problem where the attacker can send requests from within the frontend? Well, now we actually have kind of a fighting chance against that, because all calls from the frontend are channeled through this BFF, allowing us to see if something is out of order. So let's say that a frontend does like 10 requests per minute, and all of a sudden you get like 10,000. That's probably not legitimate behavior. So the BFF can be like, yeah, screw you. I'm not sending 10,000 requests per minute to the API. I'm cutting you off. Done. Additionally, you can do traffic analysis to see if steps in a transaction come in out of order. That's also a bad smell, and so on and so on. So basically, we get to reduce the attack surface of the APIs, and we get to try to detect when malicious traffic is coming in and stop it right then and there in the BFF. So at least we have some control and a fighting chance. And that brings me to the true key takeaways here. The first thing is, if you're building a non-sensitive API, a single-page application, you can handle tokens in the browser. I'm totally fine with that. What this means is, if you're building the next recipe website where you have too long explanations of what's going on before you get the actual recipe, people will hate you. That's one thing. But that kind of application, you can use tokens in the browser. I'm fine with that. Nothing to worry about. Of course, still follow best practices and try to hide them in a web worker and so on, but don't worry about this too much. If you're building a sensitive app, you should keep tokens out of the browser with the BFF. That's essentially my recommendation, and that's also what I work on with customers to ensure that they remain in control over what happens with those tokens. Of course, in complementary to the previous key takeaways, where you have to assure that malicious JavaScript code doesn't execute in the first place. That comes, of course, as step number 1. And then finally, if you want to push this to the next level, you can use your BFF to detect and block illegitimate traffic patterns if you like. That's fairly advanced, and you have to make sure you get the basics right first, but that's something you can do to try and detect when your SPA is going haywire. And that's essentially the takeaways from this presentation. A couple of useful references. An OAuth spec, the article I mentioned, is the number 2. Number 3 is a new one. That's Duende is one of the implementers for Identity Server. It's a company behind Identity Server, and they are about to release a BFF middleware for .NET. So BFF, the middleware basically implements all of these patterns to add to your .NET-based single-page applications, which is actually pretty cool. Interesting read and awesome work by those guys behind that. And of course, image credits for the cookie images I've been using. 2 final takeaways. I'm running an Angular security workshop in about a month. That's where you learn how to prevent the execution of malicious JavaScript code. We'll dive into a lot of detail on cross-site scripting in Angular applications, specifically for Angular that time. So if you're interested in that, definitely join that. It's hosted by Manfred Steyer, by the way. And we ran one last month, and it was an absolute success. So you should be there if you want to learn about that. And if you want to learn about OAuth and OpenID Connect, I have my own online course for that, which you can find right here. So it will basically explain all of these details that I skipped over when I talked about OAuth in this presentation. And with that, I want to thank you for watching. I am available on social media to follow. I post security-related content there when I'm actually able to do that. So definitely recommend it. And right now, I think we have a couple of minutes for questions. So I'm really excited to see what you have in store for me.
Wow. First of all, thank you so much, Philippe. This was awesome. It's incredible how well you can explain these complex security topics. So thank you so much. Also like the beautiful slides. So great work with that. It really helps in understanding these topics a lot better. So thanks for that. I think we do have a couple of questions from the chat. Sam, can you post them in our episode? Or does any of the panels members does... Maarten, do you have any questions for Philippe?
Not really, but I can really recommend his courses because I joined one of his courses back in the days. So really, if you want to learn a lot about security, do attend those courses because they're very helpful and very clear.
Got it. Thank you,
Awesome.
Maarten.
Thank you very much. Now I owe you an ice cream. So good job, man. Yeah, but you eat a big ice cream, so one is enough.
Yannick, any questions from your side? No?
No.
All good. Thank you. All right. Sam, any questions from your side?
No, I was going to say the same thing as Maarten, but he already said it. So same remark.
Yes, Sam, you get an ice cream as well. It's okay.
Brilliant. And James, you have any questions for Philippe?
No, spoiler alert, because there's been a blind state of panic going on behind the scenes over here, as we're about to reveal. But no, it's all good. Thanks for the great presentation, Philippe.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, thank you, Philippe. I do see one.
Awesome.
So David Gilson in the chat says, it looks like content security policy is the god of security. Like, how does it fit in here, Philippe?
Well, it depends, like, maybe not the correct statement, but God gives children cancer as well. So that would be a very good summary of content security policy. No, it's a really complicated story. So content security policy, CSP, it's great if you have an application that's compatible with CSP, which is, the chances are slim, to be honest. And configuring it is really hard, and even then it can only do a couple of things really well. So people believe it is like the godlike security policy. It can do everything for you, but in reality, the experts on CSP are working at Google, by the way. They're pushing this really hard, and they only consider CSP useful as a defense against cross-site scripting, against malicious JavaScript code. And even then, you'll have to follow a whole set of strict guidelines to make sure it's effective, because there have been numerous bypasses and things like that. So I think CSP is great as a second line of defense against cross-site scripting. So you focus on avoiding the problem in the first place, of which using Angular is a very good first step, by the way. And then you can think about deploying CSP to try and avoid the exploitation of a vulnerability in case one exists. But it is not a foolproof mechanism. So I don't have the numbers in this presentation, but I actually have a slide from Google's vulnerability program. And even there, I think their CSP policies would be able to catch about 60% of actual vulnerabilities, only 60%. So CSP is definitely useful, but it's not the absolute amazing catch-all security policy that a lot of people think it is. But if you want to learn more about that, well, please join the workshop I'm doing in a couple of weeks, because we actually dive into CSP and what it can do or what it can't do and what you should and shouldn't do. But yeah, it's a fair question, but it's unfortunately not one with a very clear-cut and optimistic answer. My apologies for that.
Got it. Yeah, thanks, and thanks for the question, David. Dave, you also asked a follow-up question, like the BFF also has a cookie session. Is that a problem?
No, if you configure the cookie correctly, then it's the only way to really abuse it would be through session writing, and as I explained during the presentation. And session writing is something we can't really stop. So we've never been able to stop that. But if you have a backend component at BFF that sees every request, then you can do anomaly detection. You can see if you observe requests that aren't supposed to be there. For example, if you're doing a transaction or adding a wire transfer and you have like a 3-step approach, which might be the case. I don't know. I don't build banking apps, but if you see step 3 and never saw step 1 and 2, then you probably know something is up. If you have an application that's creating data in the backend without having fetched information beforehand, that's something that's fishy. If you see a lot of requests to extract data from the APIs, which is abnormal behavior, that's something you can observe and try to block. So session writing never goes away, but with the BFF, we have a chance of trying to prevent that. But in any case, it's better than all the other options that we had, especially when you use a OAuth-based scenario that relies on cookies as well, because there the cookie can actually be abused to steal tokens from the server in this case. So yeah, it's unfortunately a nuanced story, which is why it took me about 35 minutes to get to this conclusion as well.
Yep. Got it. Thank you. And thank you for asking the questions as well. Meanwhile, we have a new question from Sion, who asked, does Pixie extensively secure an SPA? Or as you said, BFF is the way to go for sensitive apps?
All right. So short answer, no. Pixie does not secure your SPA. Long answer, Pixie is a mechanism in OAuth to ensure flow integrity. So it's a mechanism that's used a lot to ensure that the different steps in the flow are run by the same application. But in this case, the attacker can just make a flow perfectly Pixie compliant. So in this case, it doesn't add any security against the attacks that I discussed in this session. It does a lot of other good things, and it's highly recommended to use that. Absolutely, well, not recommended. It's mandatory for browser-based apps these days, but it doesn't prevent any of the attacks I discussed here, no.
Got it. Thank you, Philippe. And also thanks from the chat. People are thanking you for your answers. I really appreciate that. If anyone else has any more questions, feel free to add them in the chat. I also had 3 questions, I think, so hopefully I can still ask them. I was wondering, like when you talked about refresh token rotation, would it help there if there was an IP check? Because I believe like if the window closes of the client and then the attacker can still use that, will that have a different IP? So would that help there? Or is that too short-sighted?
Yeah, we've been trying that for a while, and it never worked in the past when we had like clunky desktop computers that you wouldn't take on a train ride with you. Today, when you hop networks with a phone or a laptop, that's gonna run into problems really quickly. So no, it's not reliable. It's often used as one of the risk indicators for certain things, like for example for authentication. If you see weird IPs or if things change or something like that, you can use that as a risk indicator. Like, hey, this is something unexpected. If I see other potential risk factors, maybe something weird is up. But as a strict security measure, it's not reliable, no.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense in terms of mobile. Then also I had a question like, are there specific auth services that you would recommend using or not using? Like there's Auth0 out there, there's AWS Cognito, there's Okta, there's other. Are you aware, like, I mean, you know, that you're an Auth0 ambassador. So would you recommend using specific services or not using specific services?
If only the answer would be that simple, that would be awesome. So no, that's a lot of what I do in my consulting assignments with clients is helping them figure out what service to use, because every service out there or every library or middleware or framework has a different angle and they support different features. So the cloud-based options are really cool if you don't want to run any servers like me, because, well, things usually go wrong when you don't have time to fix it. So the more I can offload from my applications, the better. Of course, they also have a price tag, which is a downside. And for example, Auth0 is very big on authentication. so OpenID Connect, but less advanced when it comes to OAuth features. So if you really want to build advanced OAuth flows and advanced features and control what's in your tokens and so on, people often find themselves using an identity server because it's very customizable and very extensible. But of course, it takes a lot more knowledge and expertise to get that up and running and to work with that. So there's a whole bunch of these vendors out there, and the decision of what to use is typically very much dependent on the ecosystem you're in and so on and so on. If you're doing AWS, then yeah, Cognito is probably not a wrong choice, even though I'm not a big fan of Cognito. But if you're doing Azure stuff, then you have Active Directory from Microsoft, which supports OAuth flows and so on and so on. So yeah, in reality, it's a very nuanced decision that requires an analysis of the parameters, like various things, essentially.
Yeah. Got it. Thank you so much. Yeah. Again, other people thanking you for the answers and the question. One final question. Do you have examples of a BFF like that viewers can use? Are there like code examples? I know that you mentioned one in the .NET. Is there one in like JavaScript, the language that our viewers are familiar with, available?
Sure. I have a proof of concept that I use during my courses. It's not the prettiest code example, but in a nutshell, my advice today would be, if you're implementing this yourself, I would trust the identity servers example from Duende is open source, so you can just look at what they're doing and build something like that. But in a nutshell, it's really simple. It's you implement OAuth as a client application, so you use a library. If you're building this in Node.js, for example, you would use a library like the Passport OAuth support. Integrate that in your Node.js application, configure it, and that's part one done. And then part two is basically setting up an API endpoint, like I'm going to proxy this endpoint, like /reviews to an API. And then you'll have to figure out how did you store that token information, like, oh yeah, it's in the cookie. Then you get that cookie, get the tokens out, attach them to the request, and send it out. So it pretty much depends on the implementation. And I don't have a ready-to-go code example I can share. But I would use Duende's example as inspiration if you're building your own BFF. Absolutely.
Got it. Yeah. So Kartikeyan also asked, like, does Duende Identity Server 5 BFF middleware is available now to integrate? So it is available now for? Is it ready for production? For example,
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. The blog post was the announcement that they were about to release that. That was from, I think, I lost track of time with this whole sitting at home stuff. I think it's from a couple of weeks ago, but I'm not sure. It could be 2 months as well.
Okay.
So I'm not sure if they released it in the meantime. So, but you can take a look. It's the code is easy to find, and
perfect.
For sure, there will be a prototype available, I guess, that you can already look at. But the blog post also very aptly describes how they address this, what they do to implement that BFF, and how they handle security in there as well, which is something we talked about, and they implemented some advice that I gave them to ensure that this cannot be abused as well.
Got it. Thank you so much, Philippe. Thank you for your patience in answering all these questions. This was all it, and people are thanking you for the great talk. So as always, we're used to having perfect talks from Philippe. So
it's one of the benefits of having to defend a PhD is you don't get puzzled by questions anymore. It's like this is a walk in the park. It's like, yeah, sure, I don't mind questions. I'm good.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for being. We know you have to drop off after your talk, so thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. Where can people learn more about you before you drop off?
Twitter or my website. That's the best source. But yeah, once you have my Twitter, then you'll be able to find everything else. I'm pretty easy to find. There's a lot of talks on my website as well. If you want to learn more about security, definitely do that. Or just Google YouTube my name or Google my name, and you'll find plenty of security content. Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. And yeah, feel free to subscribe to Philippe's feed, and you can also buy a course online there, which is really convenient because we all have it here in as well. I already subscribed, so you'll have to watch it. So looking forward to learning more about that. Thanks for making all of this happen, Philippe, and for securing many
or helping many developers in our community with security. Much appreciated. And thanks for being here today.
Well, thank you for hosting this event. It was great to see the team again, and I hope we can meet again real soon. That would be awesome.
Absolutely. We all look forward to that, so that we can still remember what day it is today. Yeah. So thank you, Philippe.
Bye, Philippe.
Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for being with us. All right. And then our second guest for today, James Henry. First of all, disclaimer. So while Philippe was talking, James's laptop crashed and all of his preparations and code has disappeared. So before we announce James, are you still comfortable going ahead? Do you want to postpone your session till next time? It's totally
let's
up
do
to
it.
you.
No developer has the perfect day when they're trying to build things. So this is very representative of real life. So we'll still have some fun. We'll still learn some things. So.
Wow. Well, this is amazing. So please give it up in the chat for James here. So this is going to be totally improvised. James was totally prepared, but yeah, these things happen. It's incredible. I think with Apple making new announcements on the M1 being, I think the Ala laptop was just said like, that stopped working.
A time bomb went off in it when they announced things today.
Yes, apparently. I think it was pushed by the Apple incentive probably.
I think so, yeah.
All right, but then I'll properly introduce you, James, so please allow me. So our second guest for today, James Henry, is a Microsoft MVP for TypeScript, a consultant architect for Narwhal, and the creator of TypeScript ESLint and Angular ESLint. If you're using TypeScript or Angular with ESLint, chances are very high that your node modules directory contains a lot of code that was written by James. In this session, James will teach us about the evolution of linting in Angular projects and how we can use Angular and ESLint together today. James will cover starting a brand new project from scratch, as well as migrating existing projects from TSLint to ESLint, and what the future of the Angular CLI's linting support looks like. Super curious to learn what that may be and how you will tackle that improvising wise. So kudos for that, James. James has also agreed to taking questions after his talk. So if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the chat on the YouTube page. Let's give it up. I would say twice as much for James. James, thank you so much for
only if I earn it. This could be a car crash. Yeah,
this is kudos for courage only. I mean, having your presentation file system crash a few minutes before a talk is must be nerve-wracking, so we can't imagine what you're going through and then still show up. Kudos for that alone. So please give it up for James Henry.
Thanks a lot. So I will still share my screen, but it's going to be a screen that will evolve over time. So yeah, bizarrely, so I have got a new machine, and that's my daily driver now. My laptop is what I developed the slide deck on before. And so now my slide deck wasn't transferred. I tried to transfer it before this call, and essentially my laptop has got stuck and I cannot get the files off of it. So that will teach me a lesson about making sure files are backed up on all my devices before attempting to do a presentation. But essentially, the good thing about this is I'm talking about and presenting about open source libraries. So everything I need is actually out there on the web right now, and we can go and dig through it. So the slides I had, one of the reasons I don't have them to hand as a document is it was actually an application that was running as a deck that I would run in my browser. So it was an entire repository that I hadn't transferred over. So the good thing is we can explore these things and we can talk about these things even without a slide deck. And the slide deck would have been supplementary to me talking anyway. So, and as I say, this happens in real life, right? We don't always have perfect days. We don't always have ideal circumstances. So I feel like it wouldn't be really in the keeping of this community spirit if I gave up because I didn't have a deck. We can still do this. So Angular ESLint is obviously going to be the main focus here today because we're at an Angular flavored meetup. And Angular ESLint is a monorepo that lives at Angular ESLint/Angular ESLint. So I'm going to share my screen and talk through some fun facts about it, how we got here, how it works, how you can use it today, whether you're using Angular with ESLint today or whether you want to start a brand new project. And then we'll talk, as we heard, a little bit about the future direction and what things will look like in a couple of months. So let's share my screen. Here we go. So we've got some inception going on. So that looks good to me. I'm imagining everyone can see my screen because I can see myself many, many times. So let's switch over to my other tab here. I'm going to bump it up a few. So hopefully that's a decent zoom level now. Somebody say something if it isn't. Otherwise, I assume it will be okay. So this is the Angular ESLint monorepo. It lives at Angular ESLint /Angular ESLint. And Angular ESLint is actually a tool set which builds on top of another library called TypeScript ESLint. And just to fill you in on the history, in case you're not familiar, as I'm sure you know from having used Angular before, TSLint was a tool that was made by Palantir to provide linting capabilities to TypeScript. When TypeScript was first evolving, kind of 2012 onwards, it was something that gained adoption slowly initially, and then the partnership with the Angular team at Google really is what gave the hockey stick to the graph of adoption. And at that point, obviously, a lot of us were around writing Angular JS apps, and so we were using ESLint to lint our Angular JS applications. At that moment, we had to make a choice to move to TypeScript, and that entailed moving to TSLint from ESLint. The reason why that wasn't such a great thing for us that were coming from ESLint was everything TSLint implemented had to be done from scratch. It wasn't able to reuse anything that came from ESLint. And the reason for this is most of the time when linters run, they are operating on what's called an AST, an abstract syntax tree. When we write code in our editors, obviously we care about plain text. You and I are writing the stuff that's on the left. We're writing symbols into a text editor so that we can read them as human beings. When linters and TypeScript itself runs, it's turning your code into something that looks like what's on the right, a data structure. In this case, we can represent it as JSON, a data structure that represents your program on the left. So if I do a simple statement like const foo equals true, now we have a very simple statement. You can see that this is made up of a program node that lives at the top of our tree, and the tree has branches as it goes down. So it has a body property, and within that body property, there's a variable declaration. A variable declaration node type has a declarations property, and that is an array of other nodes, etc., etc. So all these different node types, you can see these type properties here, they have certain structures. And certain elements of those structures are in common. So range information, whereabouts in terms of the number of characters along does your code sit? So we'll have a start and an end in the abstract syntax tree. This is the kind of the data that gets serialized about your program so that a linter can figure out what symbols and what types of code are actually in your program so that rules can be invoked in the linter at the right moment in time. So the reason this is relevant is because it turns out that TypeScript's AST that it builds when it compiles your code looks radically different to the AST that ESLint would build when it compiles you or runs linting on your code in the background. And it's this fundamental difference that meant you couldn't just reuse the linting rules from the JavaScript ecosystem on day one when TSLint was kind of, when TypeScript was kind of taking off in the Angular ecosystem. That's the reason why a brand new linter had to be built, because the data structure is very different internally. Now, that went on for a few years, but in the background, I was kind of beavering away, creating an alternative tool set called TypeScript ESLint. And a lot of what this tool set does is normalize these differences at the AST level. So what it does is it uses the TypeScript compiler to parse your code. So we can switch on ASTExplorer.net. We can switch the parser to be TypeScript. So now if we go in here, you'll see my AST just completely changed. It now looks very, very different. So instead of a body, we have a statements array. Inside of here, if we just go to our, instead of a type of variable declaration, we have a kind of 229. So it's very, very different when you serialize it to JSON. If we go to the interactive tree, we can get a bit more information about the types of nodes because ASTExplorer is kind of layering on some extra metadata and some interactivity for us so that we can jump around the tree and sort of infer the named type instead of the number. But as you can see, it's a very different data structure. So when the TypeScript compiler produces this behind the scenes, when your linting runs, ESLint would run directly on these node types because it was written for the TypeScript EST. TypeScript ESLint and consequently Angular ESLint actually run more, they have to run more like ESLint does, but this is still our starting point. So the TypeScript ESLint toolset is running, it provides a few different packages. Again, it's a monorepo, but one of those packages, TypeScript ESTree, handles the transformation of your TypeScript AST into a form that ESLint can understand. And so if you want to discover more about the kind of AST side of things, this is where you would go in that monorepo. This is important as well because Prettier actually uses this as well. So back before Prettier had TypeScript support, I submitted a PR to Prettier to leverage this aspect of the toolset of TypeScript ESLint because this just deals with that AST transformation. And again, Prettier wanted one AST format and TypeScript was producing another one. So that kind of normalization process, that transformation process is handled by TypeScript ESLint. So that wasn't available at the time. So that's why TSLint was kind of built out and Palantir added more features and they were trying to catch up with ESLint's feature sets, things like auto-fixing, just the sheer number of rules that are available. But obviously there's going to be a lag in that. The ecosystem of ESLint was colossal. It was across multiple types of projects. It's been going for many more years. So what you can do with ESLint out of the box and with third-party packages is very comprehensive. So basically, when TypeScript ESLint, my project over here, got to a point where it was very mature and functional, Palantir announced that they would deprecate TSLint, and the TypeScript team started using, it was kind of the other way around. The TypeScript team started using TypeScript ESLint themselves on TypeScript repo itself, and that was kind of the turning of the tide, and Palantir announced that they would deprecate TSLint, and the deprecation period lasted for about a year, slightly longer, and that passed at the end of 2020. So we're now at a point where TSLint is actually discontinued. There won't be any more pull requests or releases for that library, and I would encourage you all to think about when might make sense to switch to TypeScript ESLint if that's something you're interested in. TSLint is not going to stop working all of a sudden, but there will be no further enhancements. And obviously, ESLint continues to evolve. It has a good amount of donations and a very active team. I used to be a part of the ESLint team myself, but all I was focusing on was the TypeScript story. So it made sense for me to spin this off into its own project. And that's why TypeScript ESLint was born in around 2015, I think. So we've been going for a long time now. And I'd be remiss if I didn't give a shout out, as always, to Brad Zacher and Josh Goldberg for their amazing help in this story and getting TypeScript ESLint to a great state, and also working on the tooling to help people migrate automatically, which we'll be talking about more in this talk as well. So that's the kind of foundation. That's where we are. We're now at the place where the linter for TypeScript is ESLint rather than TSLint, because TSLint has been sunset and it's no longer going to be actively maintained. So for Angular developers, having TypeScript ESLint ready is about half the battle, I would say, because there are some things as Angular developers we care about over and above just, can we use ESLint and TypeScript together? And so that's where Angular ESLint comes in. So if you think about it, we're used to quite a lot of nice features from the Angular tooling out of the box because we have the Angular CLI. And so if I just go to my terminal here, I've already installed the latest version of the Angular CLI. I'll just bump this a bit as well, shall I? Hopefully that's decent. So I'm running the latest version of the Angular CLI here, 11.2.9. And that means that I can do things like ng-new. I can create a brand new project and I can pass some flags straight away, or I can just use the interactive prompt. So let's do that now. I'll just call it ngbe. And yes, let's use strict mode because that's definitely a better thing to do. Doesn't have any bearing on this talk, but I just recommend it. That's now going to scaffold out all the files we need for our project. And as you can see, one of those files that it's creating is a root level TSLint JSON. And that's because in version 11, this is going to be the last version that the Angular CLI ships with a TSLint implementation. So I'm going to show you now how we can, even if we want to start a brand new project today, we can start with ESLint on day one by using Angular ESLint. But I'm just going to get that project generating in the background. And so we'll switch back to Angular ESLint. One of the things we need to do when it comes to running ESLint with Angular, and because we're running it with the CLI, is we need to think about how can we make NGLint suddenly use ESLint instead of TSLint. And the way we can do that, I'll jump over to my editor, bump this up a bit. The way we can do that is by providing what's called a builder to Angular CLI. So if I come in here, we actually have some pretty detailed integration tests in the Angular ESLint repo. So I'm just going to come over to one of those. And if I come into this new workspace that was created as part of an integration test, come to the Angular JSON, you might well be very familiar with this file, or you might just be sort of have a passing familiarity with it from it just being in your projects and you never really touch it manually because you use ng-generates for everything. But inside your Angular JSON, you have a projects object. And for every project, so in this case, I have a project called V1 new workspace, V11, sorry, new workspace. That has a property inside of it called architect. And architect is a set of keys and values related to tasks that we can run using ng and then the command. So we have build, we have serve, we have extract i18n, we have test, and we have lint. So this is actually what Angular CLI uses as its source of truth for what does ng-lint actually mean for a particular project. So it's set on a project level, not for your whole workspace, because Angular CLI does support multiple projects in a single workspace. And when you run ng-lint on that project, it's going to look up in your Angular JSON, what does the lint target actually mean for this person's workspace? And the way it knows what to do is when it finds your builder implementation. Now, out of the box, the Angular CLI provides a lot of builders for you from the Angular dev kit. So for example, when we build something, our builder is the Angular dev kit build Angular browser. Behind the scenes, this is configuring Webpack for you to build your application. So what I have done is I have provided an alternative implementation of a builder from the one that does TSLint for you. It's called Angular ESLint Builder, and the name of the builder is lint within that package. And each builder receives a set of options. So as you can see with test, it sets up the Karma builder, and it receives some options. The same thing with the build, it's the builder and some options. So I needed to create a builder which could receive some options, and the implementation of the builder invokes ESLint behind the scenes. It uses the Node.js API for ESLint rather than the ESLint CLI that you might be used to. And it provides some options to you that can configure ESLint in an advanced way. So most of the time, folks only need the lint file patterns option, because this just tells ESLint the glob patterns for files that you care about, that you want to run linting on. But you can do advanced things around enabling auto-fixing by default. You can do things like change your format of your output to JSON or to XML, for example, if you have certain formats, stylish formats, I think it's called, was the XML one. So yeah, you might have certain build processes or other tooling you want to plug your results into. So those are the kind of things you can customize via options. But with this, we have everything we need to invoke ESLint natively within the Angular CLI tooling. So if I just open my terminal, this means that I can run ng-lint my project, whatever that project happens to be called, and it will run ESLint on it instead of TSLint. It's that generic mechanism that we've plugged in a different implementation into. So this is the kind of power of these targets in the architect object, that the Angular CLI team has unlocked a lot of capabilities here. You get what you need for free out of the box, but you can customize it, and we're leveraging that here. So I would hope by now our project is ready, and indeed it is. So we have our NGBE project ready to go. So let's explore that in a bit more depth. NGBE code window. So we're in an NGBE repo. So this is a brand new, with the latest version of Angular CLI repo, which means we have TSLint JSON ready for us. And it means if I run ng-lint, it's going to invoke TSLint. And as you can see, these days, the Angular team actually prints a warning for you that TSLint support has been discontinued, and they link you to Angular ESLint to follow the instructions to opt into the ESLint support instead of using TSLint. So let's do that. Let's follow the instructions and let's use the latest from Angular ESLint to get started on day 1 with ESLint instead of TSLint. But just to close the loop, we can look at the default implementation as a contrasting point. So here's what the lint looks like by default. We're using the builder from Angular Dev Kit called TSLint. And the options are different because they're specific to the TSLint builder. So that's not something that's generic across all builders. It's specific to each builder, what options they want to accept and what options are relevant for them. So there we have our lint, and we can now turn to the Angular ESLint tooling to look at some other packages that it provides as well as the builder. So let's go over here. Front and center on Angular ESLint, we have the quick start. So this is what's relevant for us now because we've just created a brand new repo. And one thing that's quite a new addition actually in version 4 is I've completely standardized the approach of adding Angular ESLint to an existing repo. It doesn't matter if that repo has existed for 5 seconds like our one here has, or if it's existed for 2 years or 5 years or whatever. You run very similar steps in each case so that we can make sure it's a really good experience for you. So essentially what we need to do, regardless of whether you've got an existing workspace that is using TSLint for ages, or if it's brand new, we run ng-add Angular ESLint schematics. So this is another package that I provide, as well as the builder, which handles all aspects of code generation. You might have heard of schematics in other contexts from the Angular CLI for generating code for you, and we provide that here. So let's take our ng-add command here and run it on our repo, which is brand new. And again, it doesn't matter if it's brand new or if it's been around for a while. As you'll see, it resolves the latest version for us automatically, which is version 4. And it's going to pull in the package. The schematics package itself implements a schematic which knows when it's being ng added. And so it runs and then figures out what other packages or what other steps does it need to do. And what it does is it installs the other packages from the Angular ESLint kind of namespace in your project, as well as the ESLint dependency, the TypeScript ESLint dependency, and I think that's probably it. Yeah, those are all the dependencies it installs for you. Then it prints this message for you and links you off to the documentation in case you'd not seen it before, and then you're ready to go. So we can have a look at the changes that it made. So just by running ng-add, we have added Angular ESLint builder, Angular ESLint plugin, Angular ESLint plugin template, Angular ESLint schematics, which was the one we actually ng added, Angular ESLint template parser, and the TypeScript ESLint dependencies and the ESLint dependency that we need. So that is all of our dependencies are now ready and ng added to our workspace. At this point, nothing has changed about our ng-add implementation. ng-add has added the dependencies for us, but we still want to change our workspace to switch to using those new dependencies. So for that, we have the final command in the steps that we need to run. So we're going to be invoking a schematic called convert TSLint to ESLint. So the way that we specify a schematic that comes from a third-party collection is we specify the name of the collection and then a colon, and then the name of the schematic that comes from that collection. Now, in this case, we're running the schematic in a certain way. Because this is a brand new workspace, we're not worried about actually converting any of the TSLint setup. We just want to switch straight to the latest recommended Angular ESLint setup. So we can do that by passing the ignore existing TSLint config flag. And we can pass an extra flag for some cleanup work, which is called remove TSLint if no more TSLint targets. So when we do that with those two flags here, I'll just copy this command. That will handle converting our setup in our Angular JSON, deleting our tslint.json, creating an ESLintRC.json, and making sure that our packages are up to date as well, which in our case they are because we only just installed the things, but it will handle that for you as well. So now we can see if we go into our diff, our Angular JSON, our lint implementation has been switched from the TSLint builder to the ESLint builder, and the relevant options have been updated as well. It's deleted the TSLint JSON. It's created us the latest recommended ESLintRC.json. So we've got something to use as configuration. So as you can see, it's extending from the recommended configurations from the plugins that come from Angular ESLint. And our package JSON had already been done, as I mentioned. So now when I run nglint, everything has already been done for us to run ESLint. So you'll see there's no TSLint warning anymore because we're not even invoking the builder that gave us the warning in the first place. Everything is now done. So I can commit at this point, and my repo is ready to use ESLint. So sorry, the other thing that it did, you'll notice it did an install at the end. The reason it did that is because it removed Codalyzer and it removed TSLint for me because we passed that extra flag. It detected when we'd converted our project, there were therefore no more projects remaining in our workspace. Therefore, we don't need Codalyzer or TSLint anymore. So in those, once you've created your workspace, you have 2 commands to run, and then your entire setup is ready for ESLint. And like I say, if you're coming from an existing workspace, your process here will be very, very similar, but you may wish to do some extra steps. You may wish to not pass this argument, for example, to ignore your existing TSLint setup. So there's much more detailed information here. If you come to the README and go to the section on migrating an Angular CLI project from Codalyzer and TSLint, here you'll see the step-by-step what to think about when it comes to migrating a project. For example, particularly if it's a project in a multi-project workspace, you need to specify the project name. And if you don't pass that flag, it will automatically convert your TSLint rules to the closest equivalent ESLint rules. Exactly how you had it in TSLint, it will try and match it as closely as possible in ESLint. So that's a difference between if you're converting an existing project and you care about the linting setup that you customized over time versus if you're starting a brand new project and you just want to opt into the latest recommended. So, but in both cases, you're ng adding Angular ESLint schematics, and you're going to be running ngg Angular ESLint schematics : convert TSLint to ESLint. Now, there's one final thing this thing did. If you think about it, converting to ESLint is one thing, but what if I want to generate a new project in the future in the same workspace? What if I want to create a library to go alongside my app? Or what if I want to create a second app? So normally, if I ran ngg app to generate a new application in this workspace, it would use the built-in schematics for that. So it would generate code again with a tslint.json. Now, obviously, that wouldn't even work at this point because we've already uninstalled tslint.json and the tslint. Sorry, we've uninstalled the tslint dependency and the Codalyzer dependency from our workspace. However, we can specify, as I said before, the collection name before we invoke a schematic. So we could run Angular ESLint schematics : app, because I have provided a schematic called app from my collection of schematics, which behind the scenes is invoking the underlying Angular schematic. So you get complete parity as to the features of the underlying Angular schematic, but I will do the customization for you to remove the tslint JSON, replace it with an ESLint rc.json, and you will basically have a seamless experience for creating new projects as you go on. Now, this is a little bit annoying to have to type this every time, this prefix. So what you can do, and what the tooling actually did for us when we kind of reset to ESLint, is in our Angular JSON file, it set the CLI property to have a default collection of Angular ESLint schematics. So that effectively sets our default collection name, meaning we can omit it when we run this command. So now if we run ngg app to create a new application in the workspace, let's call it BENG, because I'm not very inventive with names. And that will create a new project in our workspace. As you can see, it's created an ESLint.rc.json file for us. So there's no trace of TSLint. We've got an ESLint.rc.json that extends exactly how we want it to from the root ESLint config. It's got configuration that's specific to the new project. And in our Angular JSON, the new Beng project, its lint configuration is using the Angular ESLint builder. So again, once you've done that initial setup, those 2 commands, you are fully set up with Angular ESLint on a brand new project today. And you can do the same thing on an existing project. So if you're migrating towards ESLint from TSLint, you can do this same trick of setting the Angular JSON CLI default collection for yourself, you can either do it manually in the JSON now that you know what it looks like, and we document it here, or there is actually a command you can run, which I can't remember if I documented. I probably did. Yeah, so it's here. So you can run the same thing using a command. There's a command called ngconfig on the CLI, and this just allows you to set any item of config in your Angular JSON. And so if you run that command, it will set this value in your Angular JSON, meaning you can just run these commands from now on. You don't need to specify the prefix of the schematic collection every time you run it. So as I say, there's no downside to this because the underlying implementation in Angular ESLint it uses the schema and everything of the underlying Angular implementation, and we invoke it directly behind the scenes. So it's not even a duplication. We call out to their schematic and then just transform the outputs so that it's ESLintified, if you like. So that is the major building blocks of Angular ESLint. The other pieces you've already actually seen as part of this process to make this possible are the plugins. So you saw some of the things it installed was ESLint plugin template, and the template parser. So the other major item that's kind of specific to Angular projects versus just TypeScript projects is that we care about HTML in Angular. And even, for example, in a React project, they're using TypeScript code effectively. They're using TSX files to run TypeScript ESLint on. So they don't have to deal with markup in the traditional way that we do as Angular developers. So we need extra tooling to make ESLint understand what HTML looks like. Now, fortunately, the Angular team has already had to kind of tackle this problem. They had to build the Angular compiler to compile your templates into an AST in order to be able to do transformations, in order to be able to derive type information from them, check your templates against your component class implementations, things like that. So the template parser in Angular ESLint is actually invoking the Angular compiler behind the scenes. It brings in the Angular compiler here at the top. It's bringing in this parse template function from the Angular compiler. And it's going to be using that to produce the Angular compiler's AST, its view of the world. And it's going to teach ESLint how to traverse that AST when it runs linting. So it's going to do what's called visitor key creation. So these are some of the node types that exist on that AST. If you remember in AST Explorer that we looked at, you can see the tree structure. You can actually go in here and pick HTML and choose either my template parser, or you can pick the Angular compiler directly, and you can see the Angular compiler's AST that it creates behind the scenes for your templates. And as you can see, again, it's radically different from the other ASTs we've been working with. So ESLint doesn't understand this AST out of the box. We need to teach it that when it reaches an element node, that an element node has some children, and it therefore needs to traverse into those children to find what we need. So the way we do that is with visitor keys. So we can say, for our element node, we have children. So please traverse into children, and please also traverse into inputs, outputs, and attributes. And as you can see, this varies per node type, what ESLint should traverse into when it runs. So once we've done that, we can actually write assertions on templates, and we can write rules on them, therefore. So we have a whole plugin dedicated to rule implementations that just relate to templates. So you might be familiar with the banana in box rule that makes sure you put your your square brackets and your parentheses in the right order in your templates. And so this is what this looks like when it runs on your code. So it's matching on a bound event node type. And if it finds one, it's going to run some assertions. If it finds an issue, it's going to report it back up to ESLint. But none of this would be possible if we hadn't taught ESLint what on earth is a bound event. Because by default, bound event is not a node type in JavaScript. That's an Angular made up type that they've created for their templates. So we need to teach ESLint how to traverse it, and otherwise we'd never have this function called by ESLint when it runs. So that ultimately results in the fact that I can come into my app component HTML and I can write my template and I can get feedback from ESLint. So if we just create a div and we create some kind of binding that we don't really have, but it doesn't really matter, and we do the wrong kind of binding syntax. So this is a violation of banana in box. I put box in bananas here, which is the wrong way around. So as you can see, I'm getting feedback in my HTML file from ESLint, specifically from the Angular ESLint template banana in box rule, that I've used invalid binding syntax and I should use expression instead, which is of this structure. Square brackets on the outside, parentheses on the inside. So all of this tooling stacks together nicely. If you don't want to care about this stuff, you don't have to, because we can leverage schematics to generate all this config for you. All of this is made possible in this ESLint config, where we specify a files pattern to match on for HTML, and then we inherit from the recommended template plugins rules that it provides. So if you never want to customize this, you never have to. You can get ESLint feedback. So I've got that error in my code now. Oops, I didn't press save. I've got that error in my code now. So as well as feedback in my editor of choice, for example, VS Code, I will also get feedback from ESLint when it runs, because it's still running ESLint when it runs. So we've got invalid binding syntax here. And as you can see, because the rule was written with an automated fixer in its implementation, I can actually run ESLint -- fix, and it's going to fix my code for me automatically. And as you can see, it transformed in front of us to now use the correct binding syntax. So all of this power, all of this tooling that's standardized in the ESLint ecosystem gets built on with TypeScript ESLint, and then that gets built on with Angular ESLint for the Angular specific concerns like Angular flavored markup for templates, and the ESLint implementation and code generation through schematics. So with that, I think we've completed our whistle-stop tour through Angular ESLint tooling. And the final thing I wanted to touch on is that, as I mentioned, I started this presentation on Angular 11.2.9. We're about a month away, I believe, from Angular 12 landing. Angular 12 is going to be the first version of the CLI that doesn't ship with any implementation for ESLint out of the box. What's going to happen in version 12 is you will get an error when you run ESLint saying there's no appropriate builder installed for you, and it will recommend that you install Angular ESLint. So the team has decided to not provide a default implementation out of the box, and instead basically delegate to these schematics I just demonstrated for you. So obviously that means over time, the toolset can get a bit simpler, because I no longer have to do any cleanup of TSLint setups by default. You can still convert old projects. I'll keep that support in there for a long time to come. But by default, I won't need to remove TSLint files for you. I can just add your ESLint config as you need it. But that's kind of the future state of this, is you will just run ng-new. You'll get a new project which has no linting set up. You don't need to remove anything. You just run ng-add Angular ESLint schematics and the schematic to add the config to your project. And that'll about do it. Hopefully Jurgen's going to reappear at some point.
All right, James, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I'm sorry. I was not in the stream. So, oh my goodness, this must have been the best improvised talk I've ever seen. So thank you so much. This was really awesome. I also love the semantic flag names that you use, by the way. It's really nice. They're long, but like very, I mean, they cannot be misunderstood. So
yeah, exactly. Really nice. It's better to be clearer rather than terse and cool, like dash RV or something. It's like, what does that mean?
Indeed. Oh, thank you so much. And before we go to questions, I want to thank you on behalf of the community for your incredible efforts in bringing ESLint to TypeScript and Angular community. I mean, the entire linting, this would not be possible without you. I mean, so thank you so much for making all of this happen. We have one question from the chat. Is actually a couple of questions now. So we have someone asking, as of which version of Angular is this supported? So you demoed it in version 11 now. Is this also supported in earlier versions?
Yeah. So if you go on Angular ESLint repo, if you very close to the top of the README, I cover the supported Angular CLI versions. So for version 1 of Angular ESLint, we supported 10.1 to 11.1 specifically, and I elaborate on why that specific range. It's because the Angular team, the Angular CLI team, experimented with project references in TypeScript for version 10, and it didn't go well, and they reverted it in 10.1. And so it's just a radically different 10.10 and 10.1 are very different beasts to try and support. So the support for Angular ESLint kicks in at 10.1 as a result when they reverted that change. Every subsequent version has not had project references. So that kicks in at that point. So there was just this brief window. So I can't support further back than that because that was a real line in the sand. But version 2 and onwards of Angular ESLint, you shouldn't be using version 1 of Angular ESLint. There's been lots of improvements that have gone in since then. So ideally, you would be on at least 11.2 onwards, which, based on my experience of upgrading repos, is pretty easy to attain as long as you're relatively close to that. If you're on 10 at least, then you should be quite okay to move to 11.2. 11 was a relatively straightforward upgrade in terms of tooling, automated migrations and stuff like that. Obviously, I've jinxed it now. Somebody will have a horrendous time, but yeah, so ideally you'd be as close to recent as you can be. Another reason for that is the something I didn't actually demo, I should have done, damn, is that very recently, thanks to an upgrade I added to the Angular compiler, we can now support the ESLint disable comments in your templates. So that AST from the Angular compiler, I added comment node kind of propagation to it. So before they were actually passing comments and throwing them away. So I added to the Angular compiler that you can now pass a flag when you pass with it to surface those comments, because we need those comments to give them to ESLint to say these have a meaning in ESLint. So yeah, so that example I gave of banana in box, you can actually add an HTML comment above it and say ESLint disable next line, for example, and you won't get that feedback anymore, just like you're used to in code. So that is only possible if you're on 11.2.8 and onwards, I think. So the last two kind of patch versions, it came out, it was counted as an internal refactor, so it landed in a patch version because it's not really a public API. I'm like the only person who uses that API outside of the Angular compiler itself, which is why it didn't need to land in a feature release. So yeah, the later the better if you can. And then please do use version 4 if you can, the very latest version that I only just released. I've made things quite a bit more straightforward. And also in terms of the plugins, I used to try and shoot for something quite close to the Angular CLI's ESLint setup, where they combine a load of different things for you. But in the ESLint ecosystem, it's kind of more traditional and idiomatic for a plugin for its recommended config to be just its own rules. So these are the rules from my plugin that I recommend you use. So what I've done instead is I've created multiple different extendable configs now that you can extend from. If you want some Angular ESLint and some TypeScript ESLint mixed together, you can still do that. But the recommended set as a breaking change now only contains Angular ESLint recommended stuff from Angular ESLint. And so you can stack that with anything you want, but it makes it much more intuitive to stack with other things. We had some people, particularly in the NX world, stacking that with certain other extendable configs, and it's harder in a monorepo particularly to trace how is a rule ending up in my final experience. Is it coming from this shareable config, this shareable config, this shareable config? And particularly if something's named Angular ESLint recommended, it's more intuitive if it only contains those things. So I would recommend version 4 for that reason. It's kind of the simplest release. It's the most modern release. And that supports 11.2 of Angular CLI onwards.
Got it. Thank you so much. And thanks for asking the question, David, in the chat as well. Then we had Peter as indeed also asking a question. Thanks for projecting it on the screen here, Sam. Thank you so much for the very good presentation and love the work you do. Migrated a medium-sized app to ESLint already, and it was as smooth as you explained it. So just goes to show like how awesome the tooling is. Thank you so much.
That means a lot, to be honest, because obviously most of the time when you maintain an open source repo, you only hear the bad cases because nobody goes up to a repo to say, this worked, that is all. They only ever tell you when there's some odd quirk with their repo that they customized in a way you never anticipated or whatever. So it's great to hear that. Thank you very much. I'm glad it worked for you. And obviously, yeah, it's great when we can lean on tooling to tackle things for us instead of manually stitching them together. So yeah, great to hear.
Awesome. And I can add to that as well. So I've also been migrating libraries from ESLint to ESLint, and it's been as smooth as butter. So thank you so much, James, for the awesome tooling. I do have a couple of questions, but I'll ask anyone else in the panel first. We do have
the other thing we do provide as part of Angular schematics, AngularLint schematics, is an update schematic. So every time we change a major version, if there is a breaking change, we can navigate for you automatically, just like you're used to with Angular CLI itself. All you need to do is run ng update Angular ESLint /schematics, and that will handle delegating to us to know what to do in that case. So most of the time, that just involves us updating all of the packages under the Angular ESLint umbrella to be the next major version for you. But in some cases, for example, the Ivy compiler actually meant that a rule no longer needed to exist because it's a fundamental compiler error now, and it never used to be. That's an example where we just got rid of a rule because we don't need it anymore. So in that case, we had an automated migration that went through and removed it from your config if you ever explicitly referenced that rule. And we removed it from our recommended, obviously. So whenever we can, we will provide those schematics. So just remember, every time you're updating, don't do npm install latest version, do ng update Angular ESLint schematics, and then you get all of that for free.
Got it. That's a great tip. Thanks for that. AA in the chat also asked, will ng new interactive ask me if I want to install Angular ESLint, or does it?
Not as far as I'm aware. That's not planned. So it's kind of going to just be up to developers to know, either to know that you need to run ng add as soon as you've done ng new, or the first time you try and run ng lint, you will get that explicit error that says, we no longer ship with a default linter. Please run ng add Angular ESLint schematics. So that's the current experience as I'm aware. That's already been merged. That's already the case in the latest pre-releases of version 12, that experience is what you get. And as you might well have seen, the writing is on the wall for Protractor as well. There won't be, as it stands, the plan is to not have a default E2E builder in a future version. I don't know if that's going to land in 12 yet, because they've done the RFC. They want feedback from the community on what that looks like. I don't want to derail this into a completely different discussion, but I don't think they're going to special case the linting thing at the moment. I think it's going to just be, if you run ng lint, you'll get the error, and you'll just have to run ng add at that point.
Got it. Thank you. And thanks, David, AA, and Peter for the feedback in the chat. I really appreciate it. Sam, do you have any questions for James? I do have a couple of questions, but I'll keep them for the end. So, Sam, if you have any questions.
You mentioned the default, what was it? Let me open up the JSON. Default collection for the schematics. I see that, for example, in an example application that we are using is that we put linter to ESLint for example, a Narwhal Angular application. So do we need to change the default collection as well, or is the change covered in Narwhal Angular default collection or collection?
So I have a section of the README of Angular ESLint covering its relationship with NX. So fortunately, because I work on both tools, it's kind of gets taken care of that way. But essentially, NX uses pieces of Angular ESLint, not all of the pieces of Angular ESLint. So NX uses the plugins is what it uses. That's what it uses. So the builder, how you actually execute ESLint, is actually provided by the NX toolkit. So it doesn't use Angular ESLint builder directly. The implementation is near identical, but it's technically using a different builder. It's also not using the schematics. So the only time the NX toolset uses the schematics of Angular ESLint is during an ng update equivalent. So NX migrate is the command you run in NX. If it finds a collection that has an ng update schematic set, it will invoke that, but automatically as it runs its NX migrate. So other than that, code generation is entirely handled on the NX side. So you wouldn't want to add the default collection if you were running an NX monorepo. You would want to leave Narwhal Angular as your collection that you run your generation from.
Thank you.
Yeah. Great question, Sam. Any other questions, Sam, for No, all good. Yannick, do you
No,
have any
thanks.
questions for James? No, all good. And then Maarten, do you have any questions for James?
Yes, but more in the sense of how often did you need to pull out some hair? Because writing tools like this,
This is a
for me,
wig.
it's mind blowing. It's when I look what the output is of the AST, it's okay, that makes sense. But writing something like this is, for me, that's mind blowing. It's very useful. But yeah, people who can do that, and yeah, thank you a lot, and the whole team or everybody who contributed to it. As a developer, it helps a lot, of course. But wow.
Thank you. Yeah, it's certainly not a linear path. It's not like I just identified what needed to be done and ticked them off day by day or anything. It's been multi-year efforts and not all at once. Like many people, I had a very, very, very bad 2020, lost my dad, and kind of derailed my world for a long time. And the open source work, obviously just non-existent during that period. And again, that's why I gave a big shout out to Brad, because Brad has kept TypeScript ESLint motoring on. And TypeScript ESLint is depended upon by all ecosystems at this point that use TypeScript. So it's like 55 million downloads a month of TypeScript ESLint. It's bonkers. So that really does need multiple people working on it all the time just to triage issues and stuff. With Angular ESLint, it's been a bit more of a labor of love on top of that. And I basically prototyped a lot of this stuff quite quickly a few years ago. And then fortunately in the last kind of 6 months, I really have iterated a lot on it, maybe 8 months, iterated a lot on it, and got it to the place where it's looking pretty strong and pretty stable. And that's what, I mean, the Angular team could see that this was evolving, and they felt confident enough to not provide their own implementation as well and delegate to this. But it is certainly not, if you've come away from this presentation thinking James is a wizard and whatever, that is not the case. Like I'm bizarrely experienced and familiar with these very specific things now, just having done them for years and years and years. But I've spent many hours staring at messages I do not understand and data structures I do not understand. And it's just a natural evolution. So it's not beyond any of you. It's just one of those things where you get deeper into it, and a lot of the knowledge stacks on one another as well. So the experience of having done TypeScript ESLint first meant I could work on Angular ESLint with a lot more knowledge and stuff. And the great thing is it leans on other open source libraries, so you can go and look at the internals, like the Angular compiler, for example. That was my first PR to the Angular compiler. The Angular team was super helpful in landing it. As I mentioned, all I did really was surface some existing data structures that were in the internals. But it's still intimidating to go to somebody else's code base that you're not familiar with and work through it. But don't ever feel like you can't open an issue on Angular ESLint to try and contribute or try and understand how something works. I'll always be happy to try and answer those questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, wow. And condolences on your dad, James. I'm pretty sure he would now agree with us that we do all think you're a wizard, honestly. I mean, the feeling that you had when you looked at other code bases is the feeling that we now have when we look at yours. So, so thank you. You are truly a wizard.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and you do get a lot of applause in the chat as well. So thanks everyone for your support there. Really appreciate it. I also have a couple of questions. Maarten, did you still have another question, or
no?
Before I ask mine, no.
Thank you very much.
Awesome, thanks. I do have a couple of them because I've been using with the convert tool for a couple of instances already. Mm-hmm. First of all, something that you mentioned, like, is there a reason that ESLint will not be the default like linting tool in Angular CLI v12? It's kind of like if ESLint is deprecated and this is available, why isn't it? Do you know? Is there
the Angular CLI team is not that big, and they have to maintain a lot of stuff. So the decision was taken that just this is a lot of complexity for them to. I mean, they're not familiar with all the stuff I've just outlined. Their developers obviously aren't familiar with this stuff either. Like like as I mentioned, I've been contributing to ESLint for like 7 years now, I think, and some of this stuff I don't even remember where I learned it or where I picked it up, and there isn't a handbook you can read. So this would be a whole new set of tools that the Angular CLI team would have to take on and maintain. on top of everything they already maintain. So I think it's just literally a capacity concern, and I mean, a solution exists that is viable. So they're delegating to it, and it's that's how it is. And there is an advantage. For example, they did actually start down the road of thinking they might have the builder in the dev kit, but the big advantage of having everything under one umbrella, like I've got it now, is I run integration tests on every single commit. So I do a full ng new of a workspace, and I convert an existing workspace, and I do all of these things, multi-project, single project, on every single commit I do with all the tooling. So if you're curious about that, I'm actually quite proud of that integration test setup. Obviously, it's all open source as well. But that gives me massive confidence every time I do a release that I haven't caused a big regression. I might still be missing some features or some bug fixes or something, but I haven't caused a major regression by making some changes. And that would be a real downside if we didn't have all the tooling together. So yeah, it would have to either all move or none of it move, and none of it is the current plan.
Yeah, got it. And probably for you, it's easier to have it under your umbrella in GitHub as well, and just be able to publish.
I don't have to wait for the official release cadence every time or anything. I can make mistakes. I can move fast. I can move slow. I can vary it as is needed. And hopefully with this particular type of tool set, obviously it will reach a point where it needs hopefully very little ongoing maintenance. At some point, it will reach just sort of a maturity level where most people are using it by default and don't even have ESLint anymore. And the common rules are covered. If you have a specific rule, you can just write your own custom rule, just like you've always done in ESLint. Not every rule needs to be a community rule. Some things are specific to your workspace. So hopefully before too long, we'll actually be at a point where this isn't a huge time drain or anything. So,
got it. Yeah. Yeah, but millions of...
sorry, one other thing on that note. At version 12, because it's such a special milestone with ESLint going from the default stuff, and because I don't anticipate lots more breaking changes, I am actually, because it's relevant to the question that came about version support, at version 12, I'm going to switch the major version of Angular ESLint to match the Angular major version. So it'll be dead simple from now on. Angular ESLint 12 goes with Angular CLI 12, and then it'll be in lockstep for the major versions thereafter.
Wow, that's perfect. Yeah.
It's perfectly fine. We went through it in NGBE, going from Angular 2 to Angular 4.
Yeah, exactly. That's true. Yeah. In my case, I'll have 7 missing versions instead of 1.
Yeah. If you ever skip a version, feel free to come and announce it live at NGBE. We're more than happy to welcome you there. And with millions of downloads. I mean, that's insane. And like, no wonder no single sweat of drop broke on your forehead when your laptop crashed. That's an insane amount of, that's an insane responsibility. I mean, imagine like what would break if, luckily it's a linting step. It's not like if
Yeah, it's a good job. NPM doesn't let you just delete packages that people are using anymore, because I wouldn't want to accidentally delete all these packages.
Brilliant. But yeah, the impact is massive. So thank you for the work that you're doing there. I also wrote down during the talk, like, does the fact that ESLint use TypeScript AST as input, does that mean that ESLint can also interpret TypeScript information on top of JavaScript information? Like, can it do like more than just what TSLint could before?
No, it doesn't do more than TSLint. You could also write rules that contain type information. There are certain categories of rules where you have to know the types of the symbols of your program in order to actually write the assertion. So, for example, when you do when you do await thenable, so you don't just await a string, for example. If you write await foo as a string, that would be a violation of that rule, because you shouldn't be doing that. It's a wasted construct. You should await a promise-like thing, and we know that from type information. So we need the type checker from the TypeScript compiler, not just the parser, which produces a static AST. We need the type checker that sits on top of the AST that the TypeScript team has written. So we use what's called parser services in ESLint to basically, when you need TypeScript type information in your rules, we compile a full program in TypeScript behind the scenes for you, and that program contains the type checker. And so we surface that to rule authors for them to use the type checker in the body of their rule implementation. So you can do everything that ranges from literally just, does this string match this thing, as like a syntax check that has no type information at all the way through to, is this thing of type promise or whatever. So yeah, you can do all of those things, and that's the reason why in Angular ESLint we assume you will probably need type rules at some point. So we set up all those tsconfig configs for you. Like we point the TypeScript ESLint tooling to your TS configs in your workspace, because without that you would only have the simple parse mode, which just is doing syntax related stuff, no type information. Both are supported because some people just want a super fast basic lint check for things like semicolons, or I mean, ideally you wouldn't use it for formatting concerns, but things like consistency of casing conventions or whatever. But some people want much more advanced, more in-depth linting checks, and so we support both use cases. And TSLint did support that as well. It's not something that's unique to this.
Got it. Yeah.
TSLint, obviously, if you think about them on a spectrum, they both have pros and cons. It's not like ESLint is uniquely superior. ESLint's massive advantage is its community and its maturity in terms of features and rules. TSLint was always playing catch up, but TSLint is a much more focused tool. TSLint is designed to work with the TypeScript compiler on the TypeScript DST, period. So you can't get faster than that as well. If you held all things equal, a tool that's general purpose shouldn't be as fast as a tool that's very specific. So there is an overhead to us passing with the TypeScript compiler, converting the AST, invoking ESLint. Like there's an overhead to that. And now for most people, it's not going to make a big difference, and it's not something which should be a huge concern for you. Your linting time shouldn't be a huge concern in your overall development life cycle. You should be caring about feature development, etc., and other tooling. But because we're doing a lot of things, you can go badly wrong in a way that you couldn't with TSLint. TSLint there was a lot fewer moving parts. With TypeScript ESLint, you can have a very fast setup. You can also have an unbelievably slow setup by accident if you do certain things. So there's a performance guide on TypeScript ESLint for trying to avoid those things. And the great thing in the Angular ecosystem, because we generate all the configs for you, we generate you a setup that doesn't have those bad setups in them. So it's essentially, if you have your program's configured in the wrong way. So we create a TypeScript program with your files in, if you tell us the wrong files to put in that program, every time we encounter a file when we lint, we'll be like, oh, that's not in your program. I'll have to create a new program for that file. Oh, that's not in your program. I'll have to create a new program for that file. So that's how you can end up with like memory errors and terrible things in the worst possible case scenario, where you just have a completely broken setup. And it's possible, therefore it does happen occasionally, that users end up in that situation, but it's made much less likely by the fact we do code generation in the Angular world for our configs. In other ecosystems, obviously, they handcraft their configs most of the time. So it's easier to shoot yourself in the foot when you're in charge of typing everything out. Sorry, that's a long explanation on that. But yeah, I don't want people to think it's super black and white. None of these things are black and white, unfortunately. It's always trade-offs with all these tooling concerns. But yeah, the great thing is we now have a massive ecosystem that can work together regardless of their kind of project choices and stuff. You can combine HTML and TypeScript and GraphQL and just vanilla JavaScript concerns with one linter and just have it work. So it's very cool.
Yeah, that's amazing. And the impact on our code bases will be enormous. I mean, even if it's a bit slower than TSLint, imagine, I mean, it will save us so much time. Catching all the errors. So, wow. Next question was, is there a way to add comment style ESLint instructions in Angular templates? But you already answered that. So as of 11. Which version?
So the important thing is that you need to be running on the latest version of the Angular compiler. So in other words, upgrade your Angular to the latest. So 11.2.8, I think it landed in. Maybe 11.2.9 is the latest. I think it landed in 11.2.8, but just upgrade to the latest patch version of Angular, because those comment nodes didn't exist on the AST for us to use So we couldn't before that point. So it's not actually, well, you need to be on a certain level of Angular ESLint. Technically not the latest, but I'd advise you to be on the latest. But yeah, it's the Angular part is also important there because it just didn't exist for us to use before that point. You won't get an error. You just won't get the comment will just be a comment. It won't actually affect the behavior of the linter in any way before that point. And again, that's documented on the TypeScript the Angular ESLint README, that point as well, which version you need to be on and how it works is on there.
Got it. Perfect. Yeah, I think I saw a GitHub issue on that where it says like comments are removed before, so the ESLint won't work. So you just went ahead and jumped in yourself and fixed it in the Angular compiler. That's that's incredible.
I opened the issue and then I fixed it as well. So, yeah.
Well,
I requested it a long time ago, and realistically, it's not a super high priority item for the Angular compiler team versus my use case. So eventually, I just rolled my sleeves up and slowly bumbled my way to the solution.
Incredible. That's perfect example of open source. Huh? Like you raise an issue and then you fix it yourself, and then you create a PR. So thanks for that. If I want to write an ESLint plugin today, what's the best way to get started? Is there like also a generator for it, template, or is it like, no, just look at it?
No, that's my first kind of dead end no, I'm afraid. So the focus of the open source time has had to go on kind of supporting the use of the tooling rather than helping the authors of the tooling. We created some utils in TypeScript ESLint for helping you create rules in general in TypeScript. I leverage those rules again in Angular ESLint. I literally use the package from TypeScript ESLint in Angular ESLint. So the best way to learn is to look at the rules that are implemented in Angular ESLint. If you want to do HTML ones, look at the ESLint plugin template. If you want to write a TypeScript one, look at ESLint plugin, because those are just TypeScript rules. There's nothing Angular about them. So you can see how the utils from TypeScript ESLint are used. You can see how to write a rule, and obviously ESLint.org gives you the underlying rules syntax that you're using, like the create function that returns node patterns, node types node kinds to match on, and ultimately the tooling, the utils are just giving you a TypeScript powered version of that, so that you get type information, autocomplete, stuff like that on your ESLint rules that you write. But yeah, I'm afraid there isn't a step-by-step guide on how to write a rule. The best way is to just look for a similar rule, either in TypeScript ESLint, because there's a massive number of rules in there on that TypeScript ESLint repo, or the Angular ESLint repo, and just try and find something that's relatively close to what you want to write and have a go.
Yeah, sounds great. So yeah, it would be nice to have like a template repo that says like, here's the machinery, here's how you can test a rule and publish it, and then awesome. Yeah, maybe a great idea for someone listening in this talk to create such a repo to help James here. Only a couple of questions left. I hope do you still have the time, James? Because we're running over. If 4 more questions. Yeah. All right. When writing an ESLint plugin, what's the best way to test the AST code to see whether your selectors are correct, or like whether your code? What does that typically look like for you? Because I see the code like bound context, or what was it, like bound? How do you test something like that? If it doesn't work, is it like, oh,
yeah? So this is again like, don't have the impression I'm a wizard. My tool of choice is console log.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So
I'm sure there are better workflows with attaching a debugger and all that kind of magical stuff that I never use. But yeah, console log is a wonderful thing. If you want to figure out what an AST looks like for your source code, ASTExplorer.net that I showed in this talk is an unbelievably useful resource. I've used that so much for creating all of these things because it's vastly superior to console log for seeing the structure, because it's interactive. You can click around on it and it navigates you around your code, and you can see all of the information at a glance. You can search obviously very easily versus just printing it out in your console or something. But yeah, don't be afraid of simple like logging approaches to things as well, because ultimately all of this lives in your node modules as well. So you can even put logs inside of ESLint itself as it runs if you need to. But the AST Explorer, if you just want to see the structure of just take your source code, paste it into the left-hand side of AST Explorer, make sure you pick the right parser. So if if you're wanting to do a TypeScript rule, pick the TypeScript ESLint parser from the dropdown. And if you want to do an HTML one, pick the Angular ESLint template parser. And yeah, that's the best way to look at this structure itself.
Yeah, that's a great tip with the ES Explorer and then picking the right parser. So thanks for sharing that. And yeah, console log, we all use it. We had Jan Niklas here, our XCS core team member, and he said he does tab-driven development with console logs and tab statements. So it's like, I guess we all do it, right? It's we'll never forget that one. Then almost there. So is ESLint and the new tooling part of NX yet? If you do, if you create a as part of the normal team, you mentioned that, right? So it's in there, but not entirely the same as Angular CLI. So you support both, like native Angular CLI and NX monorepo?
Yeah. So they were both written by the same guy, me. Some of the tooling is directly shared. Some of the tooling is very similar, duplicated, if you like, but just it made sense to separate some of it in case they need to diverge in the future. So Liza mentioned the rules are coming from Angular ESLint. They're the exact same rules. There's no duplicated rules or anything in NX, but the code generation of NX is handled by NX internally. The builder, as NX calls them these days, the executor is an NX specific thing. And it's fully supported in both use cases. The great thing with NX is because they control the full flow, you don't need to do any kind of ng add ever. You just pick ESLint as your linter for your Angular project when you generate it with NX generate, and it's there. So there's no additional customization you need to do at all in that case. You just generate your project with ESLint. And ESLint is the default linter, so you don't even need to specify the linter. If you use normal Angular, just an NX generate app, and you're getting an ESLint setup. And now, as of 2 or 3 versions ago, we have a convert schematic, just like the convert schematic I showed today in NX as well. So if you're using NX with TSLint today, you do actually have a conversion schematic available for your Angular app in an NX specific context as well. So again, it will try and convert to your equivalent set if it can. And if you want to just reset to the recommended, you can do that now as well. I think that was just released today. It got merged a little while ago, but that ignore existing TSLint config flag got released today, I think, in the latest version of NX. So you can do essentially all the things I demoed today specific to NX. But yeah, you would do it with your NX tooling rather than the Angular CLI tooling.
Got it. Yeah, I can attest to that. So tried that before and it working like a charm. So
great.
Awesome. Two final questions. So if you have a monorepo with hundreds of libraries, would you then migrate them one by one? Is that the way? Or is it like...
It's a project by project basis. Yeah, it's a project focused tool. It's the only real way to make it work because that's how things are configured. You have a TSLint JSON per library. So we need to migrate those things because you could have customizations per library. There's no way to just do it in one command. However, if you go hunting around, I did even see on the NX repo, some guy just posted a bash script where he's just invoking the like conversion generator or like schematic in a loop for all of the JSON entries in his Angular JSON. So I mean, you could write a meta script on top of invoking ngg convert TSLint to ESLint. If you have literally hundreds, then that might be the best way for you to do it. So yeah, but just a simple. I mean, you don't have to write in Bash. You could do it in a simple Node script. Just require your JSON file, grab the project's key, iterate through them, and use that as the name reference to your exec of your child process on the ngg convert TSLint to ESLint.
Yeah, perfect. Another candidate for PR here for someone who's listening. Great.
I think that tool can stay in the community. I think if you want to maintain that. The more things I accept under the umbrella, the more things I have to maintain as well, and that's kind of
true that.
It's an unusual case, I think. It really, it's certainly not vocally. People aren't coming up saying, "I have hundreds of projects in my thing." And I appreciate it does exist, but hopefully that's one area where some community tooling could help out.
Yeah, no, true. And also, I liked it one by one because it's like usually errors pop up. Like ESLint seems to be more strict than ESLint. So it's like usually at the same time you then fix the errors that pop up after migrating. So so it goes like, it has a direct impact on the code already. It's like the code becomes more. So yeah, great work with that.
I mean, that partly might be down to that fact that I mentioned that before now, the recommended set contained additional rules as well. So you might find that happens less from now on if you choose the recommended rather than I have another config called ng-cli compat to make it as close to the TSLint from the Angular CLI as possible. So yeah, it's possible you'll see some variance in that now that version 4 is out. But yeah, you're absolutely right that sometimes there can be differences when you've changed linter on the actual errors you get. Maybe it was green before and now it's got some warnings or some errors.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, and which is good. I mean, stricter the better. So thanks for the improvements there.
Or if you don't like the feedback, please turn the rule off, because you wouldn't, having worked on linters for like 7 years, as I mentioned, you wouldn't believe the amount of irrational comments that you see. Like, I hate ESLint. It gives me these bad messages. It's like, ESLint literally does nothing out of the box. You have to tell it a config. You have to tell it what you want it to tell you about. It does nothing. So how can you irrationally hate your linter that you've told it to tell you an error, and it tells you that error exists, and then you hate the thing? So yeah, if you have an error you don't like, please turn it off and don't worry about it ever again. You don't have to have any of these rules enabled in your workspaces. It's entirely up to you. And there's no judgment if you want to disable all of the recommended config. It's there to help you, and you don't have to use any of it.
Watch out what you're saying now, James, because everybody might now be deleting all the stuff, all the
disabling all rules. Yeah,
yeah.
See, it works.
Yeah,
and it's fast.
It's very fast if you have nothing that runs. Yeah.
But I forgot to ask in the previous, because you mentioned NX. Does it also tie into NX caching? Like let's say that you add a lint rule. Does it automatically know, like, oh, we need to relint that?
The lint process itself. So like when you run NX lint, that at the process level, like it knows, have any of your source files changed? No. Okay, just return the cached response for the linting. It's no different to build or test. So it's not special cased. It's not running some of your rules from the cache or something. It's not like a super granular thing. If your project was linted and you haven't touched it since it was last linted, you'll get an instant cache response.
Yeah, got it. But if you touch the main ESLint rc.json, then it will know to you should see that in your NX.json. There's an implicit dependencies object that specifies the files that cause all other projects to be affected if they are affected. Got it.
So you will see that entry in there. So that's how that relationship works.
Perfect. Wow, thank you so much. Final question. Development of TypeScript, ESLint, Angular ESLint. I mean, Maarten said this must be massive. This is a massive effort, massive undertaking. I mean, don't even try to understand how you all manage it. But is there anything as a community that we can do to support the development of all that? I mean, this must cost you so much time and effort. Like, what can we do as a community to support that? Do you have like a page where we can support, or is this all your?
Yeah, I mean, I have a buy me a coffee link on the Angular ESLint things. I drink a lot of coffee. I turn caffeine into code, as most developers do. So I mean, I'd be very grateful for any small coffee cups that you purchase through that. We also have because TypeScript ESLint is more of a kind of a group effort. We have an open collective on there which you can donate to. We haven't actually been. We need to actually use some of those funds, because we've got a pot developing now, and we need to actually reward the contributors on that a bit more. For Angular ESLint specifically, in terms of tasks to be done, I would love some help documenting the rules that we have. So Codelizer was obviously the main source of inspiration for the rule sets. It was the first job was converting rules from Codelizer to Angular ESLint. But we don't really have lots of nice docs around, like, this rule exists because of this, and here's an example of it broken, here's an example of it correct, or like, here's invalid usage, here's valid usage with this rule enabled. You can look at TypeScript ESLint rules as a guidance rule for like what they look like, the docs. We've got one rule with that kind of format. If you felt so inclined, it doesn't require you to know anything about the code base. but you likely know probably something about the rule from having used it or looking at the Angular style guide, which it enforces. If you opened a docs PR, that would be very gratefully received. So yeah, that would be one example of kind of low barrier to entry contribution.
Perfect. Yeah, I hope someone who's listening actually takes action on this one. So if you all contribute to, like, say, one rule with the documentation, this would greatly help. So
that'd be amazing.
Thank you so much, James, for all of the goodness that we just were able to hear. I think the feedback in the chat is also amazing. Lots of claps there. So thank you so much for being with us here.
Sorry again about my slide. I mean, in the end, I think the slides were just meant to complement. Like, I would have done a lot of these walkthroughs anyway, but it's so crazy that is. I don't know what to say. Anyway,
to be honest, I don't think it could have been any better than this. So this was perfect. Thanks for. Kudos. Like, no single drop of sweat on your forehead while you were presenting. So that's awesome. We learned a ton, and we really appreciate you being here this evening. Before we jump off, like, where can people... Oh, we have it already, so thanks for sharing. But where can people learn more about you personally, James? Like, where do people go to?
Yeah, Twitter's definitely a good one. It's Mr. James Henry, Mr. James Henry on Twitter. I have some courses on typescriptcourses.com, which you can check out. I need to do a bit of an update on that. And then jameshenry.blog. I blog very, very, very sporadically. Those are all the places. But yeah, Twitter's the main one. If I have anything exciting to announce, that's always where it goes. So Mr. James Henry, Mr. James Henry on Twitter. Any exciting releases or updates to Angular ESLint. For example, I tweeted about the template commenting stuff most recently. So that's where I'll announce things like that.
Perfect. That is amazing. Thank you so much again for being here and for all the goodness that you bring to both the TypeScript community and to the Angular community.
You're very kind. Thank you very much.
Massive. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks everyone for watching and for being so interactive in the chat. We really appreciate you being here as well, and look forward to seeing you again. Have an awesome day, evening, morning, wherever you are. Stay safe and see you again in the next episode. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.